So now we have the outcomes of World War II. We've covered the major battles and the turning points. What happened because of World War II? What were the effects? So the first major outcome is that the European powers lost their empires. Empires were pretty much destroyed because of the Second World War and dismantled, and you have new countries being created and running themselves. You also have two major world powers established, the United States and the Soviet Union. There were war crimes trials. Remember the Nuremberg Trials that we talked about last note set? So people being held accountable for their individual actions in the war. You also have the division of Europe and the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain was a metaphorical wall divided between the West and the East, and that was pretty much the divide between the US and the Soviet Union. You've also got the establishment of the United Nations, the international peacekeeping organization, that definitely was more successful than the League of Nations. You have the Marshall Plan, which is the plan to rebuild Europe after the World War. And you also have the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Warsaw Pact. So we have new alliance systems now. NATO was the alliance system for the US and its allies, and the Warsaw Pact was the alliance between the USSR and their allies. And obviously, scissors beat paper, Churchill versus Hitler. So, the Nuremberg Trials. After the war, 24 Nazi leaders were put on trial in Nuremberg, Germany, and they were charged with war crimes. Those that put on trial were accused of one or more of the following. So, crimes against the peace, basically waging an aggressive war crimes acts against the customs of war killing, so killing prisoners, stealing private property, the destruction of towns and cities, those all count as war crimes. And then crimes against humanity. Those include the murder, extermination, deportation, and enslavement of civilians. Half of them, 12 out of the 24, were sentenced to death, with 7 more being sent to prison, despite claiming that they were only following orders. So that was no longer considered a viable defense. So the significance of this, in the Nuremberg trials, Nazi leaders and others were convicted of their war crimes. This emphasized that individuals were incredibly responsible for what they did during a war, regardless of any orders. So even if your commanding officer says, hey, capture those people, send them to a work camp, and then kill them, you are still following it. You are still responsible for that action because, yes, you did it. So the trials led to an increased demand for a Jewish homeland, and they ultimately got Israel out of the land over in the Middle East. Minority participation in the war. African Americans generally served in segregated military units. Yes, we were still segregated during World War II. And they were assigned to non-combat roles, but they demanded the right to serve in combat roles rather than support roles. So that started to change some things. Certain all-minority military units. The Tuskegee Airmen was an African American military unit. They served in Europe with high distinction. They're the ones pictured on the right. They were heavily decorated because they had done such brave acts during the war and they had done such good to helping end the war effort. And then you've also got the Nisei regiments, which were Asian American. They also earned a very high number of decorations. So these were all of that minority and they were highly decorated. Additional contributions of minorities through the war. Communication codes of the Navajo, so the Native Americans, they were used, so it was an oral, not a written language, and therefore it was also impossible for the Japanese to break it, so it was a perfect code. The Navajo codes are still unbreakable. Mexican Americans also fought, but they were not segregated. And minority units suffered very high casualties, and they won numerous unit citations and individual medals for bravery in action. So they were very well decorated and honored for their sacrifices. Economic resources during the war. So the U.S. government and industry forged a very close working relationship to allocate the resources effectively. Rationing was used to maintain supply of essential products to the war effort, so cutting back on how much you used and saving more. War bonds and income taxes were used for financing the war. And businesses basically reworked themselves from peacetime to wartime production. So instead of Ford participating in car manufacturing, they moved to tank manufacturing. The whole effort was, let's focus on the war, not on what's going on at home. Human resources during the war. So more women and minorities entered the labor force as men entered the armed forces. So it's the same pattern we've seen through every war that we have fought in so far. The citizens volunteered in support of the war effort also, having donation drives and doing as much as possible to help the war effort. We wanted to help our men and women that were serving abroad. Military resources used during the war. So the draft or selective service was used to provide personnel for the military. So what happens is, guys, when you turn 18, you're required by the federal government to register for selective service. Girls don't have to, but guys do. And what that does is basically it puts your name into this file and it says, okay, he's 18, he's X, Y, and Z, and he's got these characteristics. Okay, fine. Well, if we happen to go to war and we need people to help fight it, they can pull up your folder and say, hey, I'm pulling up your draft card. You're going to war. That's basically what it is. Even if you're not participating in the military currently, they're putting you into the military. Women during the war. Women increasingly participated in the workforce in order to replace the men serving in the military. Again, this is nothing new. Rosie the Riveter was seen as the icon for women. Now, she wasn't a real person, but she was a caricature of what women should be doing. Hardworking, strong. We can do it in order to help the men. They typically participated in non-combat military roles, basically being secretaries or handling the phones, stuff like that. Oh, and also, like medical stuff. African Americans during World War II. So African Americans continued migrating to cities in search of jobs in war plants. This continued that great migration movement that we were seeing earlier in the century. They also campaigned for victory in war and equality at home. So if you look at the sign in this image, if Negro men can carry guns for Uncle Sam, surely they can drive milk wagons for Bowman Dairy. So the idea is, if black men are able to go fight, why are they not able to drive milk wagons? Because yes, your milk used to be delivered to your doorstep on a daily basis. You didn't pick it up from the grocery store. So, internment, Japanese internment. So following Pearl Harbor, there was this huge fear that any Japanese Americans would immediately turn on us and they would become double agents and they would feed the Japanese what we were doing. In reality, it was an extremely small percentage. Like, we're talking less than 1% of the Japanese American population was doing this. But there was a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment or prejudice. So what happened was all of the Japanese Americans were rounded up and moved into these internment camps. Now, these are nothing like the concentration camps. They're basically a town behind a fence. And they were constantly watched and monitored and made sure that they weren't doing anything illegal, but they had to stay in that town behind the fence. So they were relocated to these internment camps all throughout the West. So if you look, multiple per certain states, depending on the Japanese population in that area. It only affected those living on the West Coast because the population numbers were so small in the rest of the country that it really didn't bother them. The Supreme Court, they upheld the government's right to do that. They didn't say, oh, hey, you can't do that. That's really not all that legal. It doesn't really follow the Constitution. No, they said it was okay. Ultimately, a public apology was eventually issued by the U.S. government, and financial payment was made to those survivors. So it kind of is a little bit too late, but at least the government is recognizing its errors. Media and communications during the war. So the U.S. government had strict censorship of reporting of the war. So they kind of kept everything under wraps, and they didn't want our news to get out to the Japanese or to the Germans, and we wanted to keep everything kind of close to the vest. Public morale and ad campaigns kept Americans focused on the war effort. They tried to keep it as positive as possible and not very negative. We are strong, we are capable, we are able to do this. The entertainment industry also produced a lot of movies, plays, and shows that boosted morale and patriotic support for the war effort, as well as portraying the enemy in stereotypical ways, so often negative and stereotypical. We'll look at a couple of examples of those in class.